When she was 9, a German gardener in a frozen New York carriage yard knelt beside a wooden frame and pushed her hand into a pile of damp straw and horse manure. She expected cold. What met her fingers was heat, wet, steady, alive, rising from the heap like breath from something sleeping. He told her that rot could make warmth if you fed it air and water and kept it from the sky. She filed the lesson the way children file the strange truths of adults, without understanding, without forgetting. 6 years later, she stood alone in a barn on the Dakota prairie with no wood, no stove, and no one coming to help, and the only warm thing for miles was the stable waste the town threw out each morning. Autumn of 1887 had already turned cold in Hanson County when the westbound placement train pulled into Cottonwood Crossing with 11 children and one girl old enough to be called something else. Nora Callahan was 15. She carried a pasteboard valise softened by snow and handling, a Bible with a cracked spine, a tin kettle, a spoon, and $11.40 stitched into the lining of her coat. She had 2 dresses, one patched wool coat too thin at the elbows, and a pair of city boots with soles made for cobblestone, not frozen prairie dirt. The Children's Aid Society had placed her on the train in New York 3 weeks earlier. Her mother had died of fever in a Mulberry Bend tenement when Nora was 11. Her father had been crushed beneath a collapsed stable wall the following winter. She was not a full orphan by the sentimental definition. She was the worst thing, the kind of child who had once belonged to someone and now belonged to no one, passed through institutions and charity wards until the westbound trains offered the only destination left, out. The placement committee had set up in the church social hall on a Tuesday. Families came from as far as 12 miles, stamping mud from their boots, sizing up the children lined along the front pew like dry goods on a counter. The younger ones went first. A farm wife from the creek road took a brother-sister pair, both under 8, both still round-faced enough to look like they might thrive. A widower named Dressler chose a boy of 12 who could already harness a team. By late afternoon, the hall had mostly emptied. The stove iron clicked as the fire cooled. Wet wool steamed off the last men's coats. Sleigh bells faded outside as wagons pulled away. Nora sat beside her valise at the end of the pew. The committee man, a thin, tired clerk named Orrin Pardee, who had ridden from Mitchell to oversee the placements, did not look at her when he spoke. He shuffled papers. He said the families who had promised additional beds had not come. He said there was one remaining option, temporary, until spring arrangements could be made. He slid a single iron key across the table. The key opened an abandoned freight and feed barn on the settlement's eastern edge. Its owner, a man named Stoddard, had died the previous spring owing money in 3 directions, and the property sat tangled in claims no one had bothered to resolve. The barn measured roughly 28 by 50 feet, with a hayloft over a third of the structure, warped plank siding nailed to posts that had shifted in the frost, and north wall gaps wide enough to show daylight through. It had a cast iron stove with a crack running clean through the belly. It had an empty wood rack built to hold 6 cords and holding none. Pardee told her someone from the committee would check on her situation before Christmas. He said it with the careful tone of a man who knew he was lying but needed the sentence to exist so he could leave. Then he left. Nora walked to the barn alone, carrying everything she owned in one hand. The first person to tell her she would die there was Amos Bell, and he said it without malice, which made it worse. Bell was a carpenter and church deacon, 58 years old with hands like knotted rope and a reputation for building the straightest door frames in the county. He had homesteaded the quarter section south of the creek crossing in 1871 and survived winters that killed men who thought they knew cold. He was not unkind, he was accurate. And accuracy on the northern plains in October was its own kind of cruelty. He came the morning after Nora moved in. She had slept on the barn floor wrapped in her single wool blanket, her back against the south wall where the wind was weakest. Frost had formed on the inside of the north planks by dawn. Her breath hung visible in the gray light. She was boiling creek water in her tin kettle over a fire she had built from scrap lath and a handful of straw, and the fire was already dying because scrap lath burns like paper and gives almost nothing back. Amos walked the barn the way a man walks a sick horse, slowly, checking each joint and angle, already knowing the verdict before finishing the examination. He kicked the sill where rot had softened the wood. He pressed his thumb into a post and watched the grain give. He looked at the empty wood rack, then at the cracked stove, then at the gaps in the north wall where wind came through in thin, steady streams like the building was breathing the cold in. He turned to Nora. He did not sit. "This building would eat 6 cords before March," he said. "Maybe 8 with those gaps. You have no wood. Cut wood from Kellett's yard runs $1.10 a cord for soft and nearly $2 for hard, and he raises it after first snow because he can. That is $8 to $16 you do not have. Hauling requires a team you do not own. Even if you had the money and the team, splitting and stacking enough wood before deep winter is labor for a grown man working full days, and you are one underfed girl who has never held a splitting maul." He paused. He was not enjoying this. That was the thing Nora would remember, that Amos Bell took no pleasure in mathematics. "This building is larger than your means," he said. "Hire out as kitchen help in Mitchell or Huron before the roads go bad. A girl who can read and cipher can find a place. But do not stay here thinking the Lord provides fuel. He does not. Fuel is cut, hauled, and stacked by hands, and you have 2 of them and no saw." Nora asked him what he thought one person could do in this barn to live through winter. Amos looked at the cracked stove. He looked at the empty rack. He looked at the gaps in the walls and the missing rungs on the loft ladder and the hard dirt floor that would freeze solid by November and hold the cold like a stone cellar. "With what you have," he said, "nothing I can calculate." He left her a half sack of dried beans and a stub of candle. It was not charity. It was the kind of thing a man leaves when he expects to attend a burial before spring and wants to have offered something first. Nora stood in the barn door and watched him walk back toward the road. The wind was coming from the northwest. It carried the smell of turned earth and manure from the livery 200 yards west, where the town's draft horses and a few private teams were stabled. The smell was sharp and warm in the cold air, and she stood there longer than she needed to, breathing it in, not yet knowing why. She spent that first full day measuring the barn, not with a tape, she did not own one, but with her own stride, heel to toe, counting. She measured the walls and the floor and the height of the hayloft platform, and the distance between the posts and the width of the gaps on the north side. She was not yet building anything. She was learning the shape of the problem, the way Matthias Eberl had once taught her to learn the shape of a bed before filling it. Matthias Eberl. She had not thought his name in more than a year. When Nora was 9, between the tenement and the first charity ward, she had slept for a season in a carriage yard loft near Mulberry Bend. Below her, a German market gardener rented yard space for his cold frames and seedling trays. Matthias was old even then, thick-armed, slow-moving, with a beard stained yellow at the corners of his mouth from pipe smoke. In winter, when the city was locked in iron cold and the carriage yard froze from cobblestone to rafter, Matthias built hotbeds. She remembered the smell first, sweet sour steam rising from fresh horse bedding packed into wooden frames. The frost on the glass covers turning clear where warmth pushed up from beneath. Damp burlap under her palms when she helped him lay the cover cloths. The deep animal heat that rose from the heap like breath from a sleeping body. Matthias had knelt beside a frame one morning and driven his fingers into the packed manure and straw. Then he took Nora's hand and guided it into the same hole. The heat surprised her. It was not fire heat, not stove heat. It was wet and alive, and it kept coming like the pile had a slow pulse. "Yes, heat from rot," Matthias had said in his heavy, careful English. "If you feed it air and water and keep it from the sky, it stays. Not forever, but long enough." Long enough for what? She had asked. long enough to grow things that need warmth when the world gives none. She had filed it the way a child files the odd lessons of adults, without understanding, without forgetting. The knowledge sat in her like a seed in dry ground, waiting. Now, standing in a barn that Amos Bell had pronounced a death sentence, smelling the livery midden on the October wind, Nora felt the seed crack open. She did not go to the livery that first day. She sat on the barn floor with her back against the south wall and thought. The kettle was cold, the fire was out. Her hands ached. She thought the way Matthias had taught her to think about a bed, not what you want it to do, but what the materials will allow. The town burned wood because it understood flame. Every homestead stacked cords in autumn and fed stoves through winter and measured survival in split logs. Wood was the currency. Wood was the math. Amos Bell calculated in cords the way a banker calculates in dollars, and by his arithmetic she was bankrupt. But the livery midden was steaming. Every day the stable hands cleaned stalls and dumped the soiled bedding, horse manure, wet straw, trampled hay, wood shavings, onto a growing pile behind the livery fence. The pile grew all winter. Nobody wanted it. In spring it would be carted to fields or dumped in a ravine. In October it sat there, steaming in the cold air like a living thing, and nobody looked at it twice. Nora looked at it. She looked at it the way Matthias had taught her to look at a hotbed frame, not as waste, but as a slow furnace already burning, already giving off heat that rose into the sky and was lost because nothing held it. The logic built itself in steps. A heap too small cooled fast. A heap too exposed lost heat to wind. But a heap built large enough, packed with the right balance of wet and dry, kept damp, and given air channels to breathe through, that heap would hold heat at its center for weeks. Matthias's hotbeds proved it every winter in New York. The frames were small, but the principle was not. The barn was too large to warm. Amos was right about that. 28 by 50 feet of drafty plank and post would swallow any heat source short of a bonfire. But what if she did not try to warm the whole barn? What if she partitioned off a smaller space, a living chamber, 16 by 20 feet maybe, inside the larger shell? And what if she built the mound right beside that chamber, under the barn roof where wind could not strip the heat, and let the warmth radiate through the shared wall? She would not be heating a barn. She would be building a room next to a furnace that burned without fire. The risk was enormous. If the heap failed, if it cooled, or went sour, or attracted vermin, or simply did not generate enough heat at this scale, she would have wasted weeks of labor she could have spent walking to Mitchell to find kitchen work. If the smell drove people to complain, she could lose even the barn. If Amos Bell was right and she was wrong, the failure would be public, humiliating, and possibly fatal. But the alternative was Amos Bell's advice. Walk away. Hire out. Become someone else's kitchen help in someone else's town, sleeping in someone else's back room, owning nothing, building nothing, waiting for someone to give her permission to exist. She had no fare east. She had no family anywhere. She had $11.40, and winter was turning, and the only warmth she could reach without money or a team was the thing the town threw away every morning. Martha Reed came to the barn on the third day. Martha was a homesteader's wife, 34, with raw hands and a face that had aged past its years from wind and work. She lived a half-mile north with her husband, 2 boys, and a dairy cow she kept alive through winter by sheer will. Martha was competent and overworked and had no patience for nonsense, and she had come because the women at the church sewing circle had told her the orphan girl was collecting manure. She stood in the barn door with her arms crossed. Nora was on her knees, sketching lines in the dirt floor with a stick, marking where the partition would go. "I want to understand something," Martha said. "The Kessler boy told his mother you asked at the livery for their stall litter. Their stall litter. Is that so?" Nora said it was. "You mean to sleep beside rot?" I mean to sleep beside heat. Martha stared at her. The wind came through the north wall gaps and moved the dust on the floor. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Heat, Martha repeated. Nora explained. She kept it short because Martha was the kind of woman who would leave if the explanation sounded like a lecture. She said horse bedding breaks down. She said it gives off warmth when it does. She said she had seen it work in New York in garden frames, and she meant to build it larger and put it beside a walled-off room and sleep against the warm side. Martha listened. She did not interrupt. When Nora finished, Martha said, I have buried one child and nearly lost another to winter fever. I will not pretend to know what heats and what does not. But I know what sickens. Rot brings fever. Rot brings vermin. Rot brings smell that clings to everything you own and marks you. You are already marked, girl. You are the orphan they could not place. You add the stink of a stable to that, and no family will take you in spring, and no man will look at you without covering his nose, and the women will cross the road when they see you coming. She was not angry. She was afraid. Afraid for Nora in the way that practical women fear for other women who do not yet understand what reputation costs on the frontier. I know what it sounds like, Nora said. It sounds like madness. It might be. Martha looked at the lines scratched in the dirt. She looked at the empty wood rack. She looked at the cracked stove. She was doing the same math Amos Bell had done and arriving at the same answer, and seeing that Nora had already arrived there too and kept going past it into territory Martha could not follow. If it fails, Martha said, you will have spent your strength on filth instead of finding work. If I find work, I leave. If I leave, I have nothing again. I have been nothing in 6 cities. I would rather fail here building something than succeed somewhere else belonging to someone. Martha said nothing for a long time. Then she turned and left. She did not say good luck. She did not say she would help. But she did not say Nora was a fool, and for Martha Reed, silence was the closest thing to an open door. The hostile voice came 3 days later, and it came mounted. Ezra Kellett rode a bay gelding and wore a coat that fit him properly, which in Cottonwood Crossing meant money. He was 41, lean-jawed, with eyes that calculated before they focused. He sold cut wood from a yard near the rail siding. He held partial interest in the livery's accounts, and he carried paper on the dead man Stoddard's effects, which meant the barn Nora occupied sat somewhere in the orbit of his debts and expectations. Nora was wiring the first section of her containment ring when he appeared. She had spent $4.60, nearly half her money, on wire, and a pair of tin snips from the hardware counter. She was bending willow rods into uprights and lashing them to forked stakes driven into the barn floor, building a circular frame roughly 10 feet across that would hold the mound upright once she began packing. Ezra sat his horse and watched her work for a full minute before he spoke. That minute was deliberate. He wanted her to know she was being observed, measured, judged. I hear you have been asking the stable for their sweepings, he said. Nora kept wiring. A girl alone can be poor and still keep clean, Ezra said. There's no shame in being placed wrong. There is shame in choosing to live like an animal when the committee offered you a roof, not a stable. The committee offered me this barn, Nora said without looking up. It has a roof. It has a roof and no heat and no future and no man to keep it, and by February it will be as cold as the ground Stoddard is in. I knew Stoddard. He could not hold this place alive, and he was twice your size and had a team. Does the stable intend to use the bedding? Nora asked. The question caught him. He had been building a speech, and she had stepped sideways out of it. What the stable does with its leavings is the stable's business. Then it is not your business either. Ezra's jaw moved. He was not accustomed to being redirected by a girl kneeling in dirt with wire in her hands. He gathered the reins and turned the horse. Unam. "When you tire of this," he said, "the barn reverts to the estate. I will not have it fouled. There are debts on this property that need settling, and they settle better with a clean building than a cesspit." He rode away. Nora's hands were shaking, but not from cold. She steadied them against the willow frame and kept wiring. What Ezra had not said was louder than what he had. He sold wood. Winter was his market. Every cord he moved between October and March was money, and the price rose as the cold deepened. A girl who heated without wood was not just an oddity. She was a threat to a principle he counted on, that warmth cost money, and the money went through him. And the barn, tangled as it was in Stoddard's debts, was worth more to Ezra empty than occupied. If Nora failed and left, the property could be stripped or folded into the claims he already managed. If she stayed and made the barn livable, she complicated his arithmetic. She understood none of this yet. She understood only that a man on a horse had told her she was dirty and foolish, and she had not cried, and the wire in her hands was holding. The work began before she was ready. On the 7th day in the barn, Nora hauled her first load of stable litter from the livery midden. She had no cart, no sled, no wheelbarrow. She had 2 buckets she bought for 30 cents each, and a willow pole she cut from the creek bank, laid across her shoulders with a bucket hung from each end. The Chinese laborers on the railroad had carried earth this way, and the image had stayed with her from a newspaper drawing she had seen in New York. She did not know if it was efficient. She knew it was possible. The midden sat behind the livery fence in a heap taller than she was. It steamed in the early morning cold, and the smell hit her 10 yards out, sharp, ammoniac, sweet rotten underneath. Horse manure, wet straw, trampled hay, wood shavings dark with urine. The pile was warm to the touch, even on the surface. The stable boys watched her scoop the first buckets. 2 of them laughed. One, a sandy-haired boy named Fossey, asked if she was planting a garden in October. She said nothing. She filled both buckets, settled the pole on her shoulders, and walked the 200 yards back to the barn with the weight swaying and her boots sinking into the soft ground where wagon ruts had cut the mud. The first load took 20 minutes round trip. The buckets held perhaps 40 pounds each. The mound she needed, 10 feet across and 7 feet high when packed, would require hundreds of loads, thousands of pounds. Weeks. She made 6 trips that first day. By the 6th, her shoulders were bruised where the pole sat, and her arms trembled when she tipped the buckets. She ate a handful of dried beans and a piece of hard bread for supper, and slept on the barn floor and woke before dawn to do it again. By the 4th day of hauling, the frame was a quarter full. The material inside was wet and dense and already warm at the center when she pushed her hand in. That warmth was the first proof. Not proof enough, not proof that the scale would work, not proof that the heat would last, not proof that a sleeping bay built beside it would stay warm through a Dakota night, but proof that the principle was real, that rot made heat, that the memory from Mulberry Bend was not a child's invention. She hauled through rain, she hauled through the first sleet, she hauled when her palms split at the base of her thumbs and bled into the pole. She hauled when she was dizzy from skipped meals because flour cost money and she had spent too much on wire. She hauled when boys on the road pinched their noses and called her names she pretended not to hear. The barn began to smell. Not the choking stench Martha feared, not yet, but a warm, heavy biological odor that filled the south end and pushed into the loft. It was the smell of process, of things happening at the level of bacteria and heat and moisture that no one in Cottonwood Crossing had words for. It was the smell of Matthias Eberl's yard, and it made Nora's chest tight with something that was not quite grief and not quite hope. By the end of the 2nd week, the mound was rising inside its wire and willow ring, waist high and growing. The partition wall was not yet built. The living bay existed only as scratched lines on the dirt floor. The weather was turning colder. Nights had dropped below freezing. Morning frost stayed on the ground until midday. The trees along the creek had gone bare, and the sky had taken on the flat, white, featureless quality that meant the plains were closing down for winter. She had perhaps 6 weeks before deep cold, maybe less. The mound needed to be twice its current height. The partition needed to be built. The floor needed insulation. The air channels needed to be placed. And she was one person with 2 buckets and shoulders that ached so badly she could not lift her arms above her head by nightfall. One evening, at the end of a 12-trip day, she sat against the south wall with her back to the plank and her hands open in her lap. The blisters had broken and dried and broken again. The skin across her palms was raw and tight. Her shoulders felt like someone had beaten them with sticks. She had eaten nothing since morning. She looked at the mound, the shapeless, steaming heap of horse waste and straw inside a ring of bent willow and wire, and for the first time she heard Amos Bell's voice in her own head. "This building is larger than your means." The doubt was not new. It had been with her since the first bucket, but tonight it spoke in the voice of every adult who had ever decided she was not enough. The charity ward matrons, the committee man with his sliding key, Amos with his cord count, Ezra with his clean and dirty sermon. She had been measured by other people's arithmetic her whole life, and the numbers had never come out in her favor. She sat there for a long time. The barn creaked in the wind. The mound steamed faintly in the dark. She could smell it, warm and wrong and alive. Then she stood up, washed her hands in the bucket of creek water she kept by the door, and began sketching the partition layout on the floor by candlelight. She worked until the candle guttered. She slept 3 hours. She woke before dawn. She went back to the midden. If someone has ever told you that what you were building made no sense, that the math did not work, that you were wasting your time, tell us about it in the comments. Because what happened next in that barn changed everything. The morning after Nora's darkest night of doubt, the thing she needed most arrived on foot, uninvited and furious. Berit Haugen was 62 years old, Norwegian-born, and built like a fence post, straight, weathered, and harder than she looked. She had homesteaded a quarter section a mile south of town with her husband, who had died 8 years prior of a burst appendix, and she had held the claim alone since then through winters that would have broken most men. Before Dakota, she had worked in a market garden outside St. Paul, where Scandinavian truck farmers grew early vegetables using the same horse manure hotbeds that Matthias Eberl had built in New York. Berit did not come because she had heard about Nora's project and wanted to help. She came because she had heard about it and wanted to stop it. "You're packing it wrong," she said, standing in the barn door with her arms at her sides and her mouth set in a line that meant argument was not yet invited. "I could smell the imbalance from the road. Too wet, too dense. You have no air moving through that heap, and it will go sour inside a week, and you will have a mound of cold slime instead of a heat source." Nora stared at her. She had not spoken to anyone about the method in those terms: air, balance, heat source. She had not used the word hotbed to anyone except Martha, and Martha had not understood it. "You know what this is," Nora said. "I know what it is supposed to be. What it is right now is a girl's guess at a thing that requires more than guessing." Berit walked to the mound and drove her hand into the side. She held it there for 3 seconds, pulled it out, and smelled her fingers. "The bottom is compacting. You have no drainage. The center may be warm, but the edges are already cooling because you built the ring too wide for the volume you have. And these willow stakes," she kicked one. It wobbled. "These will not hold when the weight settles." "Can it be fixed?" Nora asked. Berit looked at her. The look lasted long enough for Nora to understand she was being assessed, not for her knowledge, which was clearly inadequate, but for something else. Willingness, maybe. Or the particular stubbornness that keeps a person hauling filth in buckets when every voice says stop. I did not say it could not work, Beret said. I said you're doing it wrong. That is not the same thing. She took off her coat, hung it on a nail, and rolled up her sleeves. They worked until dark. Beret did not lecture. She demonstrated. She pulled material from the mound's base and restacked it in alternating layers. Wet, hot manure bedding below. Then a stratum of drier straw and wood chips. Then another wet layer. Then dry. Building the heap the way a baker layers dough, each stratum feeding the one above it. She showed Nora how the ratio mattered. Too much wet material, and the heap drowned its own heat. Too much dry, and it would not ignite the microbial fire that drove the process. She bundled dried reeds into tight sheaves, drove them horizontally through the mound at intervals, and said, "Leave them 3 days, then pull them out. The holes they leave will let the heap breathe. A heap that cannot breathe goes cold or goes foul. Either way, it fails." She tested by hand and by iron. She had brought a 2-foot iron rod, slender as a poker, and she drove it into the mound center, left it for a count of 60, and pulled it out. She held the rod against her wrist. "When this comes out too hot to hold for more than 2 seconds, the core is working," she said. "When it comes out warm but holdable, the heap needs feeding or turning. When it comes out cold, you have failed and must start again." Nora asked how she knew all of this. "I grew lettuce in January in St. Paul," Beret said. "The beds were smaller, but the heat is the same heat. Biology does not care about your reasons. Feed it correctly, contain it, and it burns. Feed it wrong, and it dies. There is no prayer involved." They reinforced the willow ring with heavier stakes and doubled the wire. They shaved the mound's outer layer, where cooling had already begun, and repacked it with fresh material from the midden. Beret showed Nora where to position the mound relative to the planned partition, close enough for radiant warmth to reach the sleeping bay, far enough that the bay wall would not absorb moisture from the heap. By nightfall, the mound looked different, tighter, structured. The layers were visible in cross-section where Beret had cut a viewing notch, and already the center was hotter than the edges. Nora could feel the difference through the iron rod. Beret washed her hands in the creek bucket and put her coat back on. "I will come again Thursday," she said. "You need to build the partition before you build the mound higher, or you will be heating empty air, and you need to eat. You look like a girl who has been skipping meals to buy wire." "I have beans," Nora said. "Beans do not build muscle. I will bring salt pork." She left without saying goodbye, which Nora would learn was how Beret ended every visit, by simply walking away, as if farewell were a luxury she had outlived. Nora stood in the barn door and watched the old woman's silhouette shrink down the road in the last light. The mound behind her ticked and settled in the way that large, warm things do when they are alive with process. The iron rod, still leaning against the wire ring where Beret had left it, was warm to the touch. 6 weeks to deep winter, a mound half built, a partition not started, a floor uninsulated, one girl with split hands, and an old Norwegian woman who came on Thursdays. The temperature that night dropped to 19 degrees. Nora slept against the mound side wall of the ring, on the dirt, wrapped in her wool blanket, and for the first time since arriving in Cottonwood Crossing, she did not wake shivering. The warmth was faint. It was not enough, but it was there. And outside, the prairie turned colder. Beret came on Thursday, as promised. She brought salt pork wrapped in brown paper, a jar of pickled beets, and a temper sharpened by the 2-mile walk and wind. She did not ask how Nora was. She walked straight to the mound and drove the iron rod into the center. She held it there, counting under her breath. She pulled it out and laid the shaft against the back of her hand. "Better," she said. "Not good. Better." They worked through the morning on the partition wall. Beret had a builder's instinct for scavenged materials. She saw structure in things other people saw as scrap. She sent Nora to the livery to ask for discarded stall boards and broken fence rails. She walked the creek bank and cut armloads of dried cattail stalks. She bargained a sack of old hay bales from the Dressler place, paying with a jar of her own canned plums. The partition rose in layers. The base was stacked hay bales set tight against each other and braced with salvage boards nailed to the barn's existing posts. Above the bales, they hung doubled feed sacks, stuffed with dry straw, creating a quilted barrier that trapped dead air. The concept was simple, and Beret explained it through action rather than speech. Dead air does not move heat. Moving air steals it. Every gap they sealed was heat kept. Every crack they missed was heat thrown to the wind. By the end of the first week together, the partition stood 7 feet high and ran 16 feet across the barn's south bay, creating an enclosed room roughly 16 by 20 feet. It was not a wall any carpenter would claim. It leaned slightly where the hay bales had compressed unevenly. The feed sack quilting hung in rippled sheets that moved when the north wind gusted hard enough to push air through the barn's outer shell. But it was a room. It had a boundary between inside and outside, and already the difference was measurable. Nora could stand on one side and feel the mound's faint warmth collecting, then step through the gap that served as a doorway and feel the barn's raw, open cold. "Now the floor," Beret said. They laid a bed of dry straw across the living bay, then covered it with salvage planks set tight as they could manage, then a second layer of straw on top. Where the planks did not meet, they packed cattail fiber into the gaps and sealed them with a paste of clay and chaff that Beret mixed in a bucket and spread with her bare hands. The floor would never be warm, but it would no longer be frozen earth, conducting cold directly into Nora's body while she slept. The sleeping platform went against the partition wall closest to the mound. Nora built it from 2 sawhorses and a door she had pulled from a collapsed privy behind the livery. She scrubbed it with creek water and lye until her arms burned, and Beret said nothing about where it had come from, which was its own kind of approval. The platform raised Nora 18 inches off the floor into the layer of air where the mound's radiant heat gathered. It was the difference between sleeping in the cold layer and sleeping in the warm one, and Beret said this was the most important lesson. Heat rises, and the person who sleeps on the floor sleeps in the coldest air in the room. By the 3rd week, the mound stood nearly 7 feet inside its reinforced ring. Nora had hauled over 90 loads from the midden. She knew the number because she kept a tally scratched into the barn post beside the door, 4 vertical lines crossed with a 5th, the way she had learned to count days in the charity ward. Each mark was a round trip. Each trip was 40 minutes of walking, scooping, balancing, walking back. Each trip left her shoulders sorer, her hands rawer, her breath shorter. She was losing weight. Her dresses hung looser at the waist. Her collarbones stood out sharp enough to cast shadows. She ate the salt pork Beret brought, and the beans she rationed, and occasionally a potato from Martha Reed's root cellar that appeared on the barn step without a note. She drank creek water boiled in the tin kettle. She did not eat enough, and she knew it, and she could not solve it without spending money she needed for wire and nails, and the handful of tools she still lacked. Beret taught her through the work. Each Thursday, and now most Tuesdays as well, the old woman arrived and they built. Lesson 2 was air channels. Beret bundled dried reeds into sheaves as thick as her forearm and drove them horizontally through the mound at 3 heights: knee level, waist level, and shoulder level. After 3 days, she showed Nora how to grip the bundle and pull it free in one slow motion, leaving a round shaft through the packed material that allowed air to reach the mound's interior. The heat breathes through these, Beret said. Block them, and it suffocates. A suffocated heap goes cold, or goes anaerobic, and stinks like a latrine. Either way, you have lost. Lesson 3 was moisture management. Beret carried a wooden pail and poured water into the mound's top center every second day, just enough to keep the material damp without flooding it. She squeezed a handful of material from the core and showed Nora the result. Like a wrung sponge, she said. If water drips when you squeeze, too wet. If it crumbles dry, too dry. The heat lives in the middle. She made Nora test handfuls from 6 different points in the mound until Nora could judge moisture by feel alone. Lesson 4 came after a setback. On the 4th week, the south side of the mound slumped. A section Nora had packed too wet collapsed inward, dropping the height by nearly 2 feet and opening a gap in the wire ring. The slump exposed cool gray material at the base that had gone anaerobic, airless, and sour, and the smell that rose from the breach was sharp enough to make Nora's eyes water. Beret arrived that afternoon and stood looking at the damage. Good, she said. Nora stared at her. Now you know what too wet does. You will not learn it from me telling you. You learn it from failure. Dig out the dead material, repack with fresh from the midden, drier this time, and add a chaff layer before each wet layer. The ring needs 2 more stakes on this side. They rebuilt the slumped section in a day. Beret worked beside her, not above her. The old woman's hands were cracked and swollen at the knuckles from decades of prairie labor, and she packed material with a force that belied her age. When they drove the new stakes, Beret held the post while Nora swung the mallet, and neither of them mentioned that a 62-year-old woman was bracing fence posts in cold wind for a girl she had known less than a month. That evening, Nora asked why Beret was helping her. Beret was washing her hands in the creek bucket. She did not look up. You are building the thing correctly, she said. You are building it wrong, but you are building the right thing. I cannot watch a person build the right thing wrong and do nothing. It is not in my nature. Most people would say I am building the wrong thing entirely. Most people have stoves that work and wood in the rack. You have neither. When a person has nothing, the question is not what is correct. The question is what is possible. November turned. Snow fell 3 times in the first week. The Maiden froze on its surface crust, and Nora had to break through ice each morning to reach the steaming material beneath. Hauling took longer. The ground between the livery and the barn hardened into ruts that tripped her in the dark. She started before dawn now, carrying by candlelight when the mornings were too black to see, and she hauled until she could not lift the buckets, and then she worked on the partition or the floor or the vent channels until her hands stopped obeying. Ezra Kellett struck during the 2nd week of November. He did not come himself. He sent word to the livery foreman, a man named Griff, that the stable's waste was needed for road grade fill on a property Ezra held interest in, and that Griff should dump fresh bedding in the field a 1/4 mile past the fence rather than on the midden Nora had been drawing from. The effect was immediate. Nora arrived at dawn to find the midden untouched, no fresh material, and the stable boys hauling loads the wrong direction. She asked Fossey what had changed. He shrugged and said Kellett's orders. It took her a full day to find a workaround. She walked to the Dressler farm and asked to clean their horse stalls in exchange for the bedding. Dressler's wife agreed. She had 2 horses and no love for mucking out. Nora cleaned the stalls that afternoon and hauled the bedding back to the barn in 8 trips. It was half the volume she'd been getting from the livery midden, but it was something. Martha Reed when she heard what Ezra had done, said nothing to Nora about it. But 2 days later, a broken hand sled appeared, leaning against the barn door. Runners cracked but serviceable, bed still sound. It was her son's old sled, too small for hauling cord wood, but perfect for dragging buckets across flat ground. No note. Martha Reed's generosity worked the way her silence did. It arrived without announcement and left without thanks expected. The sled cut Nora's trip time by a third. Amos Bell came back in the third week of November. He stood in the barn's north aisle, looking at the mound, now 6.5 feet high and steaming visibly in the cold air, and the partition wall and the sealed floor and the sleeping platform and the vent channels with their reed bundle plugs. And his face did something Nora had not expected. It did not soften. It tightened. "You have been busy," he said. "I have." He walked to the mound and held his hand near the surface. He pulled it back. He looked at the wire and willow ring, the stakes driven deep, the chaff and clay ceiling along the base. He looked at the partition and pushed against it with his palm. It held. "The heat is real," he said. "I will give you that. The question is whether it holds through January, or whether it dies when the deep cold comes and the material freezes from the outside in." "The core stays warm if the core stays fed," Nora said. "That is a claim. Winter will test it." "That is why I built it." Amos looked at her. He was recalculating. She could see it, the same arithmetic running behind his eyes, but the numbers had changed. She was still one girl in an impossible building, but the building was no longer empty. "I hope you're right," he said. It was the first kind thing he had told her, and it frightened them both. December came down hard. The temperature dropped below zero on the third day of the month and did not climb above freezing for a week. Snow packed against the barn's north wall in drifts that blocked the worst gaps, which was a mercy Nora had not anticipated. The drifts acted as insulation, reducing the wind that had been pouring through the plank cracks. Inside the living bay, the mound worked. Nora tracked performance the way Beret had taught her. Each morning, she drove the iron rod into the mound center, held it for a 60 count, and tested it against her wrist. The rod came out hot, not scalding, not the temperature of a stoveplate or a boiling kettle, but decisively warm, warm enough that she could not hold it pressed to her skin for more than a few seconds. The core was generating heat, and the heat was radiating through the packed material and the partition wall into the sleeping bay. She hung a wet rag near the sleeping platform one dawn. By afternoon, it was pliable and dry. On the barn's north side, beyond the partition, an identical rag hung stiff and frozen. The difference was the proof, not a number, not a measurement, a rag that moved and a rag that did not. A pan of water near the partition crusted thinly overnight but did not freeze solid. On the barn floor outside the bay, a pan froze to the bottom. The living bay was not warm. Nora did not walk around in shirt sleeves. She wore her coat and her blanket, and she could still see her breath on the coldest mornings. But she could sleep. She could keep water liquid. She could sit and mend clothing without her fingers going numb. She was surviving inside the math that Amos Bell had called impossible, and every morning she woke alive was an answer to his arithmetic. Beret came less often now. The walk was harder in the snow, and her chest had developed a cough that rattled when she breathed. But she came. She checked the mound, tested the rod, adjusted a vent channel that had sagged. She taught Nora to shave off the outer crust when it cooled and cap the exposed surface with fresh, damp litter to restart the heat cycle at the edges. She taught her to watch for white mold on the surface, a sign of good aerobic activity, and to worry only if the mold turned black or green. On a Tuesday in mid-December, Beret sat on the sleeping platform after an hour of work and did not get up for a long time. Her breathing was audible across the bay. Nora brought her water and said nothing, because Beret was not a woman who accepted worry any more than she accepted thanks. I must go to my sister's daughter in Woonsocket, Beret said finally. She is sick and has no one. I may be gone 2 weeks. I can manage the mound. I know you can. That is why I'm going. She stood, and the effort it cost her was visible in her shoulders. Do not let the vent channels close. Test the rod every morning. If the core cools, feed it fresh and wet, and wait 3 days before you worry. The biology is slower in deep cold, but it does not stop. She left. Nora watched her go and felt the bay grow larger around her. The skeptics were not done. Amos had given his grudging hope, but hope is not belief. Martha had given quilts and a sled, but she still crossed herself when she passed the barn and smelled the mound. And Ezra Kellett, who had failed to cut off Nora's supply entirely, had shifted tactics. He was telling people the pile would sicken her. He said foul air from decomposing waste would bring lung fever by Christmas. He said it with the authority of a man who sold clean wood and understood the virtue of clean burning, and people listened because Ezra had money and money conferred credibility, even when the words it spoke were self-interested. The community waited for proof. Either direction. Either the girl in the barn would freeze or sicken, validating everything they believed about proper shelter and proper behavior, or she would survive, and the question of what else they had been throwing away would become impossible to ignore. December passed. The mound held. Nora held. The iron rod came out hot every morning, and every morning she was alive to test it. Then January arrived, and January had a different question to ask. The 12th of January, 1888, began as a lie. The morning was mild, absurdly, dangerously mild. Snow that had been iron-hard for weeks softened in the ruts. Men walked to the livery without buttoning their coats. The school teacher, a young man named Elias Voss, let the children out at midday to play in the sun, real sun, yellow and warm on the face, the kind of sun that made people forget where they lived and what the sky was capable of. Martha Reed's youngest boy, Cal, 7 years old, was among the children let out. He wore his coat unbuttoned and no hat. He walked toward the school with his brother that morning, and his brother turned back at the door while Cal kept walking toward the creek road to look for a dog he had seen the day before. Nora noticed the wind first. She was hauling fresh bedding from the Dressler stalls when the air changed direction. It had been pushing south, warm, gentle, wrong. Now it backed north, and the quality of the sky shifted from yellow to white to something she had no word for. A brightness that was not light, a pressure that was not wind yet. She dropped the buckets and ran for the barn. The storm front hit Cottonwood Crossing at approximately 1 in the afternoon. The temperature fell as if something had broken in the machinery of the atmosphere. Warm air vanished. What replaced it was not just cold. It was a cold with velocity, a cold that moved, that drove snow horizontal and reduced visibility to the length of an arm. The wind did not build gradually. It arrived. Nora reached the barn and hauled the doors shut. The planks shuddered in the gusts. Snow drove through every gap in the north wall, not as flakes, but as powder, a fine white dust that coated the floor and hung in the air. The barn's temperature plummeted. She could feel it dropping in real time, a physical weight pressing inward. She checked the mound. The core was still hot. The rod still burned against her wrist, and she sealed the living bay's doorway with a doubled feed sack and pushed hay bales against the base of the partition to block the draft coming under it. Then she heard pounding on the barn door. She opened it into a wall of white. Elias Voss, the school teacher, fell through the gap with two children clinging to his coat. One was a Dressler girl, 9 years old, sobbing without sound. The other was a boy named Phelps, whose face was already white across the cheeks where frostbite was setting in. Elias had blood on his forehead from walking into a fence post he could not see. His hands were bare. He had given his gloves to the children. Nora pulled them into the living bay. She stripped the wet gloves from the children, wrapped them in her blanket and the quilts Martha had left, and set them on the sleeping platform against the partition wall where the mound's heat gathered. She boiled water in the tin kettle over a small fire she built in the cracked stove. The stove could not heat the barn, but it could heat water, and hot water in a cup was the difference between a child shaking and a child recovering. The Dressler girl stopped crying. The Phelps boy's cheeks flushed as warmth returned to the skin. Elias sat on the floor with his back against the hay bales and bled quietly into a rag Nora gave him. "Cal Reed is out," Elias said. Nora's stomach dropped. "Where?" "He left the school road before the storm. His brother said he went toward the creek. I could not find him. I could not see. I had these two, and I could not—" His voice broke. He was 23 years old and responsible for every child in the settlement, and he had lost one. The barn door hammered again. Nora opened it, and Amos Bell came through the gap sideways. Snow caked on his beard and his shoulders. He had been out searching. He had found no one. The road between his house and the school had disappeared under the drift, and he had navigated by fence posts, touching each one as he passed, counting the gaps, until he reached the barn because it was the largest structure on the east road, and he could not miss it, even blind. "The Reed boy," he said. "Martha sent her husband out, but he came back, could not stand in the wind." Amos looked at the living bay, the children huddled on the platform, the mound steaming behind the partition, the air inside the bay warmer than any room he had entered since the storm broke. He said nothing about it. There was no time for reckoning. "I am going back out," he said. "You cannot see the road," Nora said. "I can feel the fence." He left. The door slammed shut behind him, and the wind screamed through the gap before Nora could brace it. 20 minutes passed. The storm did not weaken. The barn shook in gusts that sounded like something enormous throwing its weight against the walls. Snow piled inside the north aisle until the floor was white. The living bay held. The mound held. The children slept on the platform in a knot of blankets and quilts, breathing evenly, alive because they were 18 inches off the floor in a pocket of air that decomposing horse manure kept above freezing. If this story has you holding your breath, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what walked through that door next changed Cottonwood Crossing forever. The door opened again, and Amos Bell came through carrying Cal Reed. The boy was limp. His skin was blue-white at the extremities, and his lips were the color of ash. He was not conscious. Amos laid him on the platform, and the children shifted without waking to make room, and Nora stripped Cal's frozen coat and boots and wrapped him in every dry thing she had, blanket, quilts, a feed sack lined with straw, and pressed him against the partition wall where the mound's heat was strongest. She heated water. She soaked rags and laid them on his chest and his feet and his hands, replacing them as they cooled. Amos stood over her, breathing hard, his own hands shaking. He had found Cal in the ditch beside the creek road, curled beneath a fence post, already still. "His breathing is shallow," Amos said. "He is breathing. For now." Cal's body was cold through to the core. The warmth from the mound and the hot rags was fighting against hours of exposure, and the fight was not yet decided. Nora kept replacing the rags. She kept the kettle going. She kept her hand on Cal's chest to feel the rise and fall, because as long as the chest moved, The boy was alive. Then the air channel on the mound's south side clogged. She felt it before she understood it, a change in the bay's temperature, a subtle cooling against the partition wall where warmth had been steady. She put her hand flat against the feed sack quilting, and the heat was thinner. She went around to the mound and found the lower vent channel blocked with material that had shifted during the storm's vibration, collapsing the reed shaft and sealing the airway. The mound needed air. Without it, the aerobic process that generated heat would slow and die, replaced by anaerobic decay that produced cold and stench. If the channel stayed blocked through the night, the mound's core temperature would begin to fall. If the core fell, the living bay would cool. If the bay cooled, the children and Cal and everyone sheltering inside would be in a barn no warmer than any other barn, with no stove that worked and no wood to burn. Nora grabbed the broom handle she kept by the door. She drove it into the blocked channel, twisting and pushing, breaking through the compressed material. She felt the shaft clear, a slight release of pressure, a puff of warm, sour air escaping from the mound's interior. She cleared the second channel the same way, and the third, working around the mound in the dark while the wind pounded the walls. When she came back to the bay, the partition wall was warming again under her palm. Cal's breathing had not changed. She replaced the rags. She held the hot kettle close enough for steam to reach his face. Amos watched without speaking. Outside, the storm screamed, and inside, the mound's ancient biology kept burning. The third arrival came near midnight. The barn door did not open with pounding this time. It scraped slowly, as if the person on the other side lacked the strength to push. Nora braced herself and pulled, and Ezra Kellett fell across the threshold with his hired man behind him. Ezra's hands were white. Not cold white, damage white. The waxy pallor that means the tissue beneath the skin has begun to freeze. His hired man, a thick-armed German named Gerhardt, was in better shape but shaking violently, his coat crusted with ice. His hat gone. Nora did not hesitate. She pulled them into the bay. She stripped Ezra's gloves. He cried out when the leather came away from his fingers and immersed his hands in warm water. She wrapped Gerhardt in the last dry feed sack and set him against the platform where the children slept. Ezra said nothing. He sat on the floor of the living bay with his hands in Nora's tin kettle and his back against the partition wall, the wall he had called filth, the wall heated by the mound he had called a cesspit, the wall that was now the warmest surface in Cottonwood Crossing, and he said nothing at all. His woodyard was buried. The storm had driven drifts across his stacked cords until only the top tier showed, and the wind was too violent to reach it. His house stove was going, but his hired man's quarters had no fuel left, and Gerhardt had come to the main house, and together they had tried to reach the livery for shelter, and the livery was locked and the wind knocked Ezra flat twice, and Gerhardt had dragged him by the coat toward the only light visible in the white dark, the faint glow leaking from Nora's barn through the south wall cracks. The light was her candle, burning inside the bay. It had guided them like a lighthouse in a blizzard of dirt and ice. By 1 a.m, the barn held 9 people: Nora, Elias, 2 school children, Cal Reed unconscious on the platform, Amos Bell, Ezra Kellett, Gerhardt, and a widow named Agneta Holm, who had stumbled in from the road after her chimney pipe iced shut and her stove fire died. 9 people in a space designed for one, heated by a mound of composting horse manure behind a partition of hay bales and feed sacks. Nora organized them by need. Cal and the children stayed on the platform against the warmest wall. Agneta and Gerhardt sat against the hay bale base where radiant warmth was lower but still present. Amos and Elias blocked the doorway gap with their bodies and additional bales. Ezra stayed on the floor with his hands in the water. The bay was crowded, and it smelled of wet wool and sweat and the mound's warm biological odor pushing through the partition. But the air was above freezing. The bodies added heat. The mound kept generating. The system that one girl had built from stable waste and willow rods and a memory of a German gardener's hands was holding 9 lives in a box of straw, while the most violent blizzard in Dakota Territory's history tried to tear the roof away. At 3 in the morning, Cal Reed opened his eyes. He did not speak. He looked at the ceiling, the rough underside of loft planks, lit amber by the candle, and then he turned his head toward the partition wall and pressed his cheek against the feed sack quilting. The warmth against his face made him close his eyes again, but he was breathing deeper now, and his lips had color. Amos Bell watched from the doorway. He did not say the mound had saved the boy. He did not say Nora had been right. He sat with his back against the hay bales and his hands on his knees, and he watched a 7-year-old boy breathe against a wall heated by rot, and his face carried the expression of a man rewriting every calculation he had ever made. The storm blew until morning. The wind dropped near dawn, not gradually but suddenly, as if the sky had exhausted itself. The silence that followed was enormous, a physical weight after hours of roaring. Snow had buried the barn's north wall to the eaves. The south door opened onto a world remade in white. The familiar landmarks erased, the road gone, the fence posts wearing 3-foot caps of ice. Nora stepped outside, and the cold hit her lungs like a fist. The temperature stood somewhere far below 0. She could not know the number, but the air hurt to breathe and her nostrils froze with each inhalation. The sky was clear. The sun was rising. The prairie looked like the surface of the moon. Behind her, in the barn, the mound was still steaming through its vent channels. The living bay was still warm. 9 people were still alive. She went back inside. She boiled water. She fed the kettle from the creek bucket and found the water half frozen and broke the ice with the spoon handle and poured it and waited for the heat. Cal Reed sat up on the platform and asked for his mother. The storm had killed 3 people in the county. An elderly bachelor named Henning was found in his shed 2 days later, frozen where he sat, his stove cold, and his last quarter cord of wood buried under a drift he had not been strong enough to dig through. A cattleman south of the creek lost a hired hand who went out to check fences and never came back, and a child from a settlement 12 miles west died in a schoolhouse where the teacher had kept them overnight, but the stovepipe had iced shut and the fire could not draw. Cottonwood Crossing buried its dead and dug out its roads and began the slow reckoning of what had held and what had failed. Amos Bell came to the barn on the 3rd morning after the blizzard. He came alone, on foot, in cold that still cut the lungs. He did not knock. He pushed the door open and stood in the north aisle and looked at the mound, still steaming, still breathing through its vent channels, still warm to the iron rod Nora drove into its center while he watched. He looked at the living bay. The children were gone. Elias had walked them home the morning after the storm. Cal Reed was home with Martha, alive, his fingers and toes intact because the platform and the warm wall had held his body above the killing temperature through the night. Agneta Holm had gone back to her house to find her chimney pipe clear and her stove undamaged and her faith in stove wood shaken for the first time in 30 years. Gerhard had walked back to Ezra's property without speaking. Ezra himself had left before dawn the morning after, his hands wrapped in rags Nora had torn from her second dress, and he had not said a word to her on his way out. The bay was empty now, just Nora, her platform, her blankets, her kettle, and the warm wall. Amos walked the space the way he had walked it in October, slowly checking each element. But this time he was not diagnosing failure. He was trying to understand function. He pressed his hand against the partition. He knelt and felt the floor. He examined the vent channels, the wire ring, the chaff and clay ceiling. He picked up the iron rod and held it, turning it over as if the tool itself contained the explanation. "I counted wood," he said. "I have counted wood for 30 years. I came here in 71, and the first thing I learned was how many cords a man needed, and I built every winter around that number. Cords in the rack, cords on the sled, cords split and stacked before October, or you answer for it in February." He set the rod down. "I counted wood, and I failed to count what was already warm." He did not apologize. Amos Bell was not a man who apologized for being wrong. He was a man who adjusted his calculations and moved forward. But the admission cost him something visible. His shoulders changed. His voice dropped half a register. He had been the man who knew winter math in Cottonwood Crossing, and a 15-year-old girl from New York had found an answer outside his arithmetic. "Show me how the air channels work," he said. Nora showed him. She pulled a reed bundle from the reserve stack and demonstrated how to drive it through, how to seat it, how to withdraw it after 3 days to leave the breathing shaft. She showed him the layering, wet and dry, hot and insulating, and the moisture test, squeezing a handful to the rung sponge standard. She showed him the iron rod timing. She showed him the drainage trench Beret had insisted on, cut into the dirt beneath the mound's base to prevent the floor from souring. Amos asked about measurements: how tall, how wide, how thick the partition, how deep the straw on the floor. Nora gave him numbers and he filed them the way a carpenter files measurements, automatically, precisely, each figure dropping into a structure he was already building in his mind. When she told him the mound was roughly 10 feet across and 7 high, he nodded. When she told him the living bay was 16 by 20, he nodded again. He was translating the barn into the language he understood: dimensions, materials, labor, and the translation was working. "I will send my son-in-law to see this," he said. "He has a calf shed that barely holds through January, lost a yearling in the blizzard." It was not praise. It was better. It was use. Martha Reed came the same week. She did not come as the woman who had warned Nora about reputation and rot. She came as Cal's mother. She stood in the barn door with her hands at her sides, and her face set in an expression Nora could not read, something beyond gratitude, something that had passed through fear and grief and arrived at a place where ordinary words could not reach. "I want to see it," she said. Nora showed her everything. Martha walked the bay with the attention of a woman who managed a household through prairie winters with 2 boys and a dairy cow, and a husband who worked himself half to death every year just to stay even. She was not interested in theory. She was interested in the partition wall, the floor insulation, the platform height, the distance between the mound and the sleeping space. She ran her hand along the feed sack quilting and pressed it against the boards beneath, testing the thickness, the give, the way the layers trapped air. She touched the partition near the mound. She pulled her hand back and touched it again, lower, where the heat was different. "How long does the heap last before it cools?" "It depends on the feed. Fresh material every week or 2 keeps the core alive. Beret says a well-built mound can generate heat for 6 to 8 weeks before the material breaks down past the active stage, but you can extend it by repacking the outer layer and adding fresh." "And the smell?" "You are standing in it." Martha inhaled. The air was warm and biological, earthy, faintly sweet, with a sharper edge near the mound itself. It was not the stench she had feared. It was not pleasant, but it was not sickness. It was the smell of process. And Martha Reed, who composted kitchen scraps in her garden every summer, recognized it once she stopped expecting poison. "Cal talks about the warm wall," Martha said. "He says it was like leaning against a horse. He says the wall breathed." The mound breathes. Through the channels. Martha looked at the quilts, her own quilts, the ones she had left on the barn step without a note. They were draped over the partition now, stained with use and heat, and the labor of a night that had tested them beyond anything a quilt was made for. "I want you to show me how to build a smaller one," she said, "for the calf shed. If the cow dies, we lose the milk, and the cow nearly died last week because the shed was too cold. Cal's brother can haul bedding. I will do the building if you show me the layering." "I will show you." "And the school. Elias wants a warming bay in the school shed before next winter. He has not stopped talking about what he saw." Martha left, and for the first time since the blizzard, something in the barn felt different. Not warmer, not safer. The feeling was harder to name than that. The feeling was that the door was opening wider, and people were choosing to walk through it instead of crossing the road. Over the following 2 weeks, 7 people came to the barn to see the mound. Amos's son-in-law, a quiet farmer named Grindheim, came with a rope and measured every dimension and wrote the numbers in a ledger he carried in his coat. The Dressler woman came with her older daughter and asked whether the method would work for a chicken house. She had lost 8 hens to cold in the blizzard, and the flock was her egg income. Elias Voss came twice, once alone to study the design, and once with his brother Daniel, the part-time blacksmith who had bent replacement wire for the ring after the storm. Daniel brought a set of iron hoops he had forged, cleaner, stronger than the willow and wire ring, and offered them without asking for payment. A widow from 3 miles north came because Agneta Holm had told her the barn was warm, and she did not believe it and needed to press her own hand against the wall before the word warm meant anything real. Each visitor asked the same question in different words. Each received the same answer. The mound worked because it was built correctly, right size, right moisture, right air, right containment. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was biology managed with labor and attention, and anyone with access to stable waste and the willingness to shovel could build one. Nora taught each one. She was not a natural teacher the way Beret had been. She lacked the old woman's authority, the decades of experience that turned instruction into gravity. But she had something else, the ability to show rather than tell, to put a person's hand into the mound and let the heat speak for itself. She taught Grindheim the layering by making him build a test section and tear it apart 3 times until the moisture was right. She taught the Dressler woman the vent channels by handing her the reed bundle and standing back. She taught Elias the iron rod test by burning his wrist with it and watching him understand in 1 second what would have taken 10 minutes of explanation. Ezra Kellett did not come. He did not acknowledge the blizzard night. He did not thank Nora for the rags she had torn from her dress to wrap his frost-bitten hands. In the feed store and the livery yard, he minimized. Any barn full of bodies and livestock would have warmed, he said. Pack enough people in a room, and the room gets hot. The girl had nothing to do with it. He said this to men who had been in other rooms during the storm, rooms that did not warm, rooms where the stove failed, or the wood ran out, or the walls were not sealed against the wind. They listened because Ezra had money, but they listened less than before, and the gap between his words and their experience was widening with each telling. Beret returned in the last week of January. She was thinner. The cough had deepened into something that lived in her chest and spoke when she breathed, a wet, rattling sound that came from a place deeper than the throat. She walked from her homestead to the barn in morning cold that would have kept most people indoors, and when she arrived, she stood in the bay and looked at everything Nora had done during the blizzard and its aftermath, and she said, "You did not let the channels close. You told me not to. I told you many things. You listened to the right ones." They worked together that day, not on the mound, which was performing steadily, but on improvements. Beret wanted to build a secondary partition inside the bay, creating a smaller sleeping chamber within the already enclosed space, so that on the worst nights Nora could retreat into a room the size of a closet where the mound's heat concentrated most. It was redundancy, the kind of design that came from a woman who had survived too many winters to trust a single wall. As they built, Beret talked, not about the mound, about St. Paul, about the market garden and the Norwegian families who ran it, the Kavamis and the Tveits, an old Sjur Espeland who could judge soil temperature by kneeling and pressing his ear to the ground as if the earth had a heartbeat. She talked about how the hotbed frames ran in rows behind the greenhouse, each one steaming in February cold, each one pushing lettuce and radish through warm soil while the Mississippi was still frozen. She talked about her husband. Halvor Haugen had been a carpenter like Amos, but with gentler hands and a habit of singing while he worked, hymns mostly, in Norwegian, in a voice that carried across the quarter section and made the claim feel less lonely. He had built their homestead cabin with dovetail joints so tight she could not fit a knife blade between the logs. He built the root cellar, the privy, the calf shed, the fence, and then he built a cradle for a child who came early and died within the week and was buried under the elm tree east of the house. He died in August, Beret said. The appendix burst on a Sunday. The nearest doctor was in Mitchell. By the time the doctor arrived on Tuesday, Halvor had been in the ground for a day. I dug the grave myself because the neighbor was cutting hay, and I did not want to wait. She said it without inflection. She said it the way she said everything, as fact, stripped of performance, delivered in the flat voice of a woman who had outlived her capacity for drama, but not her capacity for pain. I stayed because leaving meant the claim was lost, and the claim was all he built, she said. A person stays for the work that remains, not for the grief. Grief is not useful. Nora heard the lesson inside the biography. She filed it the way she had filed Matthias Eberl's teaching about heat and rot, without fully understanding, knowing it would matter later. They disagreed that afternoon, and the disagreement mattered. Beret wanted Nora to charge for her teaching, not money. Beret had no use for money beyond flour and nails, but labor. A day of hauling for a day of teaching, a cord of stacked bedding for the knowledge of how to build a frame. They come to look, and they learn, and they build, and they owe you nothing, Beret said. That is how a woman's knowledge disappears. It is given freely and taken without debt, and forgotten the moment the man who learned it decides he knew it all along. I have watched it happen for 40 years. The woman teaches, the man learns, the man tells the story without her in it. Nora said she would not charge. She said the knowledge was not hers to sell, it was Matthias's and Beret's and the biology's. And charging for it felt like putting a fence around a river. Rivers are fenced every day on this prairie, Beret said. They are called irrigation, and men file claims on them. You are being foolish. Maybe. You are being foolish, and you know it, and you are choosing it anyway, and that is a kind of foolishness I recognize and cannot cure. The argument ended there. It was the closest they came to anger, and the closest they came to love. Beret died on the 11th of March. The cough had settled into her lungs the way winter settles into the plains, slowly, completely, without announcing when it would leave. By late February, she could not walk to the barn without stopping 3 times to rest, leaning on fence posts, her breath coming in shallow, rattling draws. By early March, she did not come at all. Nora went to her instead, walking the miles south through crusted snow, carrying broth in a jar wrapped in cloth and bread from a loaf Martha Reed had baked. On the last visit, Beret was in bed. The homestead cabin Halvor had built with his dovetail joints was warm. Beret had a working stove and enough wood, and the irony of that was something neither of them mentioned. The quilts were pulled to her chin. Her hands lay on top of the blanket, and the knuckles that had packed compost mounds and driven reed bundles and tested iron rods were swollen and still. "Do not let them turn it into patent nonsense," she said. Her voice was thin, and each word cost breath she could not spare. "And do not let the church women call it a miracle. It is not a miracle. It is manure and straw and air and water and the willingness to do work that smells bad. If they make it a miracle, they will wait for God to repeat it instead of building it themselves. I will not let them. And do not let Kellett sell it. He will try. He will put his name on a frame and charge money for what the stable throws away. You teach it faster than he can package it. That is how you win. I am not trying to win. Then you will lose. Choose." She closed her eyes. Nora sat with her until the breathing evened into sleep, and then she walked home in the dark, with the empty jar in her coat pocket and the mile of frozen road stretching ahead and behind like a question she could not answer. Beret died the next morning. A neighbor found her still in bed, the cabin warm, the stove still drawing. She had lived 62 years on 2 continents, buried a husband and a child, held a claim alone through 8 winters, and taught a girl from New York how to build heat from rot. The prairie took all of it without comment. Nora did not attend the burial. She was not invited. The Norwegian families handled their own, and she would not have gone if asked. She grieved the way Beret had taught her everything else, by working. She repacked the mound. She tested the rod. She cleared the channels. She built a second heating mound in the Dressler calf shed and a third in the reed washroom, using Cal's older brother as her hauling labor, and she built them correctly because Beret had built the knowledge into her hands, and her hands remembered what her heart could not yet hold. The bay felt larger without Beret in it. The iron rod, when she drove it into the mound each morning, felt like a question she was still learning to answer without the one person who had never doubted the answer existed. Steam rose from the mound in the cold March air. It rose the way it always rose, constant, biological, indifferent to grief. The heat did not care who tended it. It only cared that someone did. Spring broke in late March with a violence that matched the winter. Warm air pushed north and hit the accumulated snowpack, and the melt came all at once. The creek rose 4 feet in 2 days. Water spread across the bottomland and lapped at the edges of the settlement. Root cellars flooded. Seed potatoes stored since autumn, the foundation of the spring planting, sat in water and rotted. The Grindheims lost 3 bushels. The Phelps family lost half their store. 2 homesteads farther north lost everything. By early April, the settlement faced a hunger problem from a direction no one had anticipated. Not the cold, not the blizzard, but the thaw. A missed planting meant a missed harvest, and a missed harvest on the plains meant buying food at prices that could break a family already stretched thin by winter. Nora saw the solution before she could name it. She was standing in the barn, looking at the mound, which had cooled now as winter released its grip and the active compost cycle wound down. And she thought of Matthias Eberl's hotbed frames in New York. Not the warming principle this time. The original purpose, growing things in cold ground by building heat beneath them. She built the first frame in 2 days. A rectangular box of salvage boards, 18 inches deep, filled with fresh horse bedding from the Dressler stalls, topped with 6 inches of soil, covered with a window sash she bought for 60 cents from a man tearing down a burned house south of town. The bedding heated. The soil warmed. She pressed her hand through the glass cover and felt the ground beneath give under her fingers, soft, alive, while 6 feet away the open ground was still rigid with frost. She planted seed potatoes on the 12th of April, 3 weeks before anyone else in the county could break ground. Martha Reed saw the frame and understood immediately. The Grindheims lost everything. My own cellar held, but barely. How many of these can you build? As many as we have bedding and boards and hands to haul. Within a week, Nora had 4 hotbed frames running behind the barn. Cal Reed and his brother hauled bedding. Greenheim's daughter carried soil in buckets. Martha organized the women, the same women who had crossed the road to avoid the barn smell in October, into a seed-sharing collective, pooling what survived the flood so that every frame received enough to matter. If this story reminds you that the thing everyone overlooks might be the thing that saves you, share it with someone who needs to hear that right now. Ezra Kellett watched the frames go up from the road. He did not offer to help, but within days, he was telling people he could build sanitary bedding frames using materials from his lumber stock, superior to the salvage board shelters the orphan girl assembled from scrap. He priced them at $4 each, absurd for a box of boards sitting on free manure. But Ezra understood that men who would not learn from a girl might pay a man for the same knowledge wrapped in planed lumber and a handshake. Nora did not argue with him. She heard Barrett's voice. Teach it faster than he can package it. And she taught. She showed the Grindheim daughter how to build a frame from fence rails and stable waste for less than $1. She showed Elias Voss the soil temperature test and the planting timing. She showed the Dressler woman how to extend the hotbed cycle by feeding fresh material through a hatch in the side. Every person she taught was a customer Ezra could not reach, and every frame that went up without his lumber was a quiet correction to his pricing. By late April, 12 hotbed frames were running across the settlement. Seed potatoes sprouted in soil that should have been frozen. Onion sets pushed green shoots through warm earth while the fields beyond were still too hard to plow. The flood that had threatened famine was being answered by the same principle that had answered the blizzard, heat from rot, contained and directed by someone who understood what the barnyard was already trying to do. Nora stood at the edge of the barn one morning and looked at the frames scattered across the backyards of Cottonwood Crossing like windows laid flat on the ground. Through each one, green was visible, life pushing through warm soil, food growing in cold air. Barrett was not alive to see it, but Barrett's knowledge was in every reed bundle, every moisture test, every layer of wet and dry packed by hands the old woman had trained. Nora was 16 years old. She had no family, no claim, no legal protector. But she had something Ezra Kellett could not buy or sell, the trust of the women who fed the families. And the women were building frames. The question was no longer whether the method worked. The question was what Nora Callahan would become in a place that had expected her to disappear. By late summer of 1888, Nora Callahan had stopped being the orphan who lived in the barn. She had become something the settlement did not have a word for, not a farmer, not a tradesman, not a wife or a school teacher or any of the categories Cottonwood Crossing used to sort its people. She was the woman who knew heat, and in a place where winter killed and spring starved, and the distance between survival and ruin was measured in degrees, knowing heat was knowing the most important thing. The barn had changed. The living base still stood. The partition wall reinforced now with proper boards that Amos Bell's son-in-law had donated from a shed he was tearing down. The sleeping platform had a real mattress, straw-stuffed, sewn by Martha Reed from flour sackcloth. A second iron stove, small and sound, sat in the bay's northeast corner, a gift from a family whose daughter Nora had taught to build hotbed frames in April. The cracked stove was gone, hauled out and broken for scrap iron. The barn still smelled of the mound, would always smell of it, faintly, the way a forge always smells of iron, but the smell had lost its power to offend. It had become the barn's signature, and people who entered it stopped noticing within minutes. The mound itself was in its second generation. Nora had broken down the first mound in May, spreading the finished compost, dark, crumbling, rich with the broken down memory of heat across her garden plot, where it fed tomatoes and squash and pole beans that grew with a vigor that made Martha shake her head. In September, she built the replacement. Tighter layering, a stronger ring using Daniel Voss's iron hoops instead of willow, deeper drainage, and a double set of vent channels placed at angles Beret had described, but they had never tried together. The second mound heated faster and held temperature more evenly. Nora could feel the improvement through the rod. A typical October day looked nothing like the previous October. Nora rose at dawn, tested the mound, checked the vent channels, and adjusted the moisture if the surface felt too dry or too damp. She ate breakfast, real breakfast now, eggs from the Dressler woman in exchange for compost, bread from her own flour bought with money she had earned teaching. And then she taught. The teaching had taken a shape she had not planned. It began with neighbors asking questions and ended with something closer to a school. 3 mornings a week, someone came to the barn. Sometimes it was a farm wife learning to build a calf shed warming bay. Sometimes it was a hired man sent by his employer to learn the layering. Sometimes it was a child sent by a mother who understood that the knowledge Nora carried was worth more than anything the schoolteacher could offer about geography or penmanship. Nora taught the way Beret had taught her, through hands. She put people's fingers into the mound and made them feel the temperature gradient from surface to core. She made them squeeze material until they could judge moisture without thinking. She made them drive the iron rod and test it against their wrists and learn the difference between a working core and a cooling one. She corrected by demonstration, not lecture. When a man named Tollefson built his warming bay too shallow, she did not explain why depth mattered. She built a test section at proper depth beside his shallow one and made him press his hand against both walls 3 days later. The shallow wall was cool. The deep wall was warm. He tore down his version and rebuilt without being asked. The women learned faster than the men. Nora noticed this without surprise. The women were accustomed to managing biological processes, bread rising, milk souring, gardens composting, children growing. The idea that heat could come from managed decay was not strange to them. It was an extension of what they already understood. The men struggled because they thought in mechanical terms, fuel in, heat out, the stove model, and the mound did not work like a stove. It worked like a body. It needed feeding and air and balance, not loading and lighting. By the second autumn, 5 homesteads had warming bays in their outbuildings. 3 had hotbed frames ready for spring. The schoolhouse had a small mound built against its north wall, enclosed in a shed that Elias Voss had raised with volunteer labor, and the children no longer sat in coats through January. The settlement was changing in ways that went beyond heat. The stable waste that had been carted to ravines and dumped was now claimed and divided. Families who had never spoken to each other negotiated bedding shares from the livery. The women who organized the seed-sharing collective in spring had formalized into a group that met monthly to discuss planting schedules, compost quality, and winter preparation. The group had no name and no officers and no men, and it functioned better than any institution in the county. Ezra Kellett's reckoning came in November, and it came by fire. His woodshed, the long, low structure behind his house where he stored the cut wood he sold at rising prices every winter, caught from a lantern left too close to shavings on a dry night. The fire took the shed and 2 cords of seasoned hardwood and the southwest corner of his stable before the bucket brigade from the livery could stop it. No one was hurt, but Ezra's winter inventory was halved in an hour, and his hired team, 2 horses and a mule, stood in an open stable corner with the November wind coming through the burned-out wall. He could not sell wood he did not have. He could not stable animals in a building open to the weather, and he could not, after a year of mocking the method and attempting to undercut it and minimize it and profit from it, bring himself to ask the girl in the barn for help. So he sent Gerhardt. The hired man came to the barn on a Tuesday morning and stood in the doorway the way Ezra had stood on his horse a year ago, stiff, uncomfortable, performing an errand he did not want to perform. He said Kellett needed advice on building a warming shelter for the team. He said it quickly, the way a man says a thing he has been told to say and wants finished. Nora did not make him wait. She did not make him beg. She did not mention the blizzard night, or the rags from her dress, or the months of ridicule. She picked up the iron rod and a bundle of reeds and said, "Show me the stable." She walked to Ezra's property with Gerhardt and surveyed the damage. The burned wall faced southwest, the wrong direction for wind protection, but workable. The remaining 3 walls were sound. The space was larger than a calf shed, but smaller than her barn, and the team needed warmth, not comfort. A mound half the size of hers, built against the interior of the intact north wall, with a simple partition of hay bales and feed sacks creating a sheltered stall area, would hold the animals through winter. Ezra was not present when she arrived. He appeared an hour into the work, when Nora was on her knees in the stable, marking the mound's footprint with a stick. He stood in the doorway and watched her the way he had watched her wire the first ring a year ago, calculating, assessing. But the calculation had changed. A year ago, he had been measuring a girl against his contempt. Now he was measuring his need against his pride, and need was winning. "I did not ask for charity," he said. Gerhardt asked for advice. "I gave it. The labor is yours. I will pay for the materials. The materials are horse manure. You own horses. The materials are already yours." The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound Nora had heard since arriving in Cottonwood Crossing. It was the silence of a man who had run out of ways to frame his dependence as anything other than what it was. "Show Gerhardt the layering," Ezra said. "I will send him to the livery for bedding." "I will show Gerhardt. I will also show you." Ezra's jaw worked. He looked at the stable floor. He looked at the marked footprint. He looked at the iron rod in her hand, the same tool Beret had carried, the same tool that had tested the mound that saved his hands and his hired man and the children and Cal Reed and everyone else who had stumbled through the barn door on the worst night in Dakota Territory's memory. "Fine," he said. They began that afternoon. Gerhardt hauled bedding from the livery. Ezra did not try to redirect the waste this time, did not send word to Griff to dump it elsewhere, and Nora taught them both the layering. Wet manure bedding first, spread 6 inches deep across the footprint, then a stratum of drier straw and wood chips, 4 inches, then wet again. She made Ezra do the spreading himself. His frostbite-scarred hands, the skin was still tight and shiny across the knuckles where it had healed, pushed through the same material he had called filth, and he worked without complaint because the horses standing in the cold stable corner behind him gave no room for pride. She showed him the moisture test. Ezra squeezed the handful, and water ran between his fingers. "Too wet," Nora said. He added dry chaff and squeezed again. This time, the material held together without dripping. "That is the feel you want. Every layer, every time." She showed him the reed bundles for vent channels and how to place them and when to pull them. She showed him the iron rod test and made him hold the rod against his wrist after a 60 count in the core. He flinched at the warmth. The pile was hours old, and already the biology had started. 3 days, Nora said. "Test it again in 3 days. If the rod comes out hot enough to make you pull away, the core is working. If it comes out cool, the layers are wrong and you rebuild." Ezra nodded. He did not thank her. He would never thank her. But he had knelt in stable dirt beside his hired man, and learned to build the thing he had called a cesspit, taught by the girl he had tried to drive out, in a stable he had failed to protect by the methods he had always trusted. His hands smelled of horse manure and damp straw, and the distance between that smell and his contempt for it had collapsed into nothing. The warming shelter for Ezra's team was operational within a week. Gerhardt maintained it through the winter. The horses and the mules survived without incident. Ezra never spoke of the teaching publicly. He never acknowledged that the method worked. He never again mocked it in the feed store. He simply stopped talking about it entirely, as if the subject had ceased to exist. That was his conversion. Not a speech, not an apology, not a dramatic reversal, just silence where contempt had been, and a warm stable where a burned one stood. Daniel Voss had been in the periphery since the blizzard, the schoolteacher's brother, the part-time blacksmith who bent wire and forged iron hoops and appeared at the barn when something needed shaping that hands alone could not manage. He was 25, broad across the shoulders, quiet in the way of men who work with metal and fire and have learned that noise accomplishes nothing that heat and pressure cannot do better. He came to the barn in December of that second winter to deliver a set of replacement hoops for the mound ring. The old ones had corroded where moisture from the heap had eaten the iron, and Daniel had forged new ones with a coating of linseed oil that he said would slow the rust. He fitted them himself, kneeling in the barn aisle, working the hoops around the mound's base and tightening them against the stakes with a wrench he had made from scrap. Nora watched him work. He did not talk while he worked, which she appreciated. Most men who came to the barn felt the need to fill the space with words, questions about the method, comments about the smell, opinions about what she should do next. Daniel filled the space with competence. He measured the hoop diameter against the mound's circumference and adjusted without asking. He saw where a stake had loosened and reset it without being told. He noticed the drainage trench needed deepening where the floor had settled and marked it with a scratch of his wrench before she could point it out. When he finished, he stood and looked at the mound the way Amos Bell had looked at it after the blizzard, with the expression of a man recalculating. But where Amos had been rewriting his winter arithmetic, Daniel was seeing something else. He was seeing a system, material, structure, process, maintenance, and the system interested him the way a well-built forge interested him, as a thing that worked because every part served every other part. "The vent channels," he said. "The reeds compress after a few weeks. The shafts close. I repack them, pull and replace. What if the channel lining were iron, a tube, open at both ends, set into the mound? The material packs around it, but the tube holds its shape. You would not need to pull and replace." Nora looked at him. In a year of teaching and building and refining, no one had suggested a structural improvement to the method. They had learned what she taught and built what she showed them, and that was the end of their thinking. Daniel had looked at the system for 20 minutes and found a weakness and proposed a solution. "Can you make them?" she asked. "I can make anything that bends." He made 6 iron vent tubes from rolled sheet stock, each 18 inches long and 2 inches across, with small holes punched along the length to allow airflow through the tube wall, as well as through the open ends. Nora set them into the second winter mound, and the difference was immediate. The channels held their shape through weeks of settling, the airflow was more consistent, and the mound's temperature evened out across its volume, instead of running hot at the center and cool at the edges. It was a small improvement. It was also the beginning of a partnership. Daniel came back. He came with ideas, a hinged hatch in the mound ring for feeding fresh material without dismantling the structure, a sheet iron reflector panel behind the partition wall to bounce radiant heat into the sleeping bay, a drip pan system beneath the mound that collected leachate for garden fertilizer instead of letting it soak into the floor. Each idea required metalwork. Each visit required time. The time became regular, and the regularity became expectation, and the expectation became something neither of them named but both of them relied on. They did not court the way the settlement expected courting to work. There were no Sunday visits in clean clothes, no church pew proximity, no negotiations between families. Nora had no family, and Daniel's parents were dead. And the conventions that governed pairing in Cottonwood Crossing did not apply to two people who had built their bond over iron hoops and compost heat. They courted the way they worked, practically without waste, each gesture carrying exactly the weight it needed and no more. The first time Daniel stayed past dark, it was because a vent tube had jammed and the extraction required two people, one to hold the mound ring steady and one to work the tube free with pliers. They worked by lantern light, shoulder to shoulder in the narrow space between the ring and the partition wall. And when the tube came loose, Nora stumbled backward, and Daniel caught her arm and held it a moment longer than the catch required. Neither of them mentioned it. But the next time he came, he brought 2 cups, and they drank coffee together after the work was done, sitting on the sleeping platform in the warm bay while the mound breathed beside them. That became their evening. Work first, then coffee, then conversation that started with iron specifications and ended with things that had nothing to do with iron at all. One evening in early spring, Daniel told her about his parents. His father had been a watchmaker in Cincinnati who drank himself quiet and then drank himself dead. His mother had followed within the year, not from drink, but from the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent her strength holding a household together and had nothing left once the household dissolved. Daniel and Elias had come west with an uncle who died of cholera in Sioux Falls, and the brothers had walked the rest of the way to Cottonwood Crossing because it was the next name on the map, and they had no reason to choose one place over another. "I chose to stay because the forge needed a blacksmith," Daniel said. "That was the only reason. A place needed a thing I could do. That was enough." Nora understood that logic with her whole body. It was the logic of the barn, the mound, the iron rod. A place needed a thing she could do. That was enough. That was everything. Daniel moved his forge tools to the barn in the spring of 1889. He built a small smithing area in the north aisle, away from the mound, where he could heat and bend and shape without risking sparks near the dry straw. The arrangement was unconventional, an unmarried man and an unmarried woman sharing a working space, and Martha Reed told Nora plainly that the arrangement would need resolving before winter, or the churchwomen would resolve it for them in ways neither of them would enjoy. They married in October of 1889, the same month Dakota Territory split and became 2 states. The ceremony was brief. Amos Bell stood as witness. Martha Reed brought a cake. Elias Voss read from a book of verse that had nothing to do with the Bible and everything to do with the fact that he was the only person in the settlement who owned poetry. Daniel gave Nora an iron ring he had forged from the same stock as the mound hoops, and she wore it for the rest of her life, and the metal carried the faint smell of linseed oil that she associated with the moment she understood that competence was the only form of love she would ever fully trust. The years compressed the way years do when the crisis has passed and the work becomes rhythm. Nora and Daniel expanded the barn into a proper boarding stable and winter yard. They built foaling stalls heated by managed compost bays, smaller, more refined versions of the original mound, maintained on rotating schedules so that fresh heat was always available. They built a spring seedling house with 12 hotbed frames that supplied early starts to families across the county. They took in horses through winter, charging modest board, and the income was steady and sufficient and earned entirely from the thing the town had called filth. Their first child came in the autumn of 1890, a girl they named Beret, without discussion, without explanation, as if the name had been waiting in both of them for the decision to arrive. The second child, a boy named Halvor, came 2 years later. The names carried weight. They were debts paid to the dead, and the children who bore them grew up in a barn that smelled of warmth and process, and the particular stubbornness of a mother who had once hauled manure in buckets across frozen ground because no one would give her wood. Nora taught the children the way Beret had taught her, and Matthias had taught Beret's generation before that, by putting their hands into the heap. Little Beret could test moisture by feel before she could read. Halvor could drive a reed bundle by the time he was 6. The knowledge passed through hands, not books, and the hands remembered. There were hard years among the good ones. The winter of 1891 brought a January cold snap that tested every warming bay in the county. Nora spent 3 days moving between homesteads, checking mounds, reopening collapsed vent channels, adjusting moisture levels in bays that had been built by people still learning the balance. She carried the iron rod in her coat the way a doctor carries a stethoscope. It went where she went, and its reading was final. 2 bays failed that winter. One had been built too small and could not sustain core temperature in extreme cold. The other had been packed without air channels by a man who thought he understood the principle well enough to skip the parts that seemed unnecessary. Nora rebuilt both. She did not lecture the owners. She made them watch while she tore the failed mounds apart and restacked them correctly, and the lesson landed harder for having been paid for in frozen animals and lost income. Daniel's forge work grew alongside the method. He designed standardized components, iron vent tubes, ring hoops, hinged feeding hatches, rod probes marked with notches at the 60-count interval that made the building process faster and more reliable. He sold these at cost plus labor to anyone who asked, and the modest income supplemented the boarding fees and the seed starts and the compost sales that had become the Voss household economy. They were not prosperous by any measure that Ezra Kellett would have recognized. But they owed nothing, and they fed their children, and the barn was warm every winter, and the garden produced more than any garden its size had a right to produce, because the soil ate finished compost the way a hungry body eats bread. The school children of Cottonwood Crossing learned a different kind of lesson from the one in their primers. Elias Voss, and later other teachers who followed, brought students to the barn once each autumn to see the mound built and to understand the principle. The children were taught to test heat with the iron rod before they were allowed near a new pile, a small ritual of safety that became tradition. Over the years, the lesson simplified and hardened into a thing the settlement simply knew. Heat comes from rot if you manage it, and managing it is work, and the work is worth doing. By the mid-1890s, variations of the warming bay and the hotbed frame had spread to homesteads across Hanson County and into neighboring counties. The spread was not dramatic. No one filed patents, no one published pamphlets, no one built an industry. It was the slow lateral movement of practical knowledge through a network of women who talked to each other at church and at the feed store and across fence lines, passing the method the way they passed recipes and remedies and the names of reliable midwives. Beret Haugen had warned that women's knowledge disappears when it is given freely and taken without credit. She was half right. The knowledge did not disappear, but it did lose its author. Within a decade, people in the county built hotbed frames and warming bays without knowing where the practice came from. They called it common sense. They called it old knowledge. They did not call it Nora's. Nora did not mind. She had chosen to teach freely, and the cost of that choice was anonymity, and she had made the choice with her eyes open because Beret had told her she was being foolish, and she had agreed and done it anyway. The method lived in the county's hands. That was enough. That had to be enough. Ezra Kellett died in 1893 of a stroke, sitting in the feed store he had frequented for 20 years. His woodshed had been rebuilt. His stables still used the warming bay Nora had taught Gerhardt to maintain. In his effects, among the ledgers and the debts and the property claims, There was no mention of the blizzard night or the barn or the girl who had wrapped his hands in strips of her own dress. He had carried the debt in silence and paid it in silence and died without acknowledging that silence was its own confession. Amos Bell lived to see the new century. He built a warming bay in his own workshop in 1891, not because he needed it, but because the principle interested him, and he was a man who could not let an unbuilt thing stay unbuilt. He told people who asked that he had learned it from a girl who came off a placement train with $11 and a tin kettle and no business surviving, and that she had survived because she understood something he had spent 30 years failing to see. It was the closest Amos came to admitting he had been wrong, and he said it often enough that it became his version of an apology. Martha Reed remained Nora's closest friend for the rest of both their lives. Cal Reed grew up to work the family homestead and kept a warming bay in his calf shed every winter until he was an old man, and he told his own children about the warm wall in the barn during the blizzard, and his children told theirs, and the story lived in the Reed family longer than it lived anywhere else. Within 10 years of that first winter, more than 20 families across Hanson County had adopted some version of the warming bay or the hotbed frame. The number was small. The impact was not. Each family that kept animals alive through a killing freeze, each family that started vegetables 3 weeks early, each family that stretched a thin winter into a survivable one because a mound of horse manure behind a hay bale wall gave them degrees they could not otherwise afford. Each one was an answer to a question the town had asked in the autumn of 1887, when it slid a key across a table and expected the girl holding it to die. Nora Callahan. Voss lived out her life in the same valley where she arrived unwanted. She did not become rich. She became necessary. In later years, she was the person widows and young couples visited in October when they wanted to know whether their winter preparations were honest or hopeful. She could judge a warming bay by smell and a hotbed frame by touch, and a person's readiness for winter by the look in their eyes when she asked how many cords they had stacked. She died in 1926 in the barn Daniel had rebuilt around her, in the same bay where she had first slept against the warm wall, with the iron rod still hanging on its nail by the door. On the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature in southeastern Dakota Territory dropped from above freezing to more than 30 degrees below in a matter of hours, and the wind drove snow so hard that people standing 10 feet apart could not see each other. A carpenter and church deacon named Amos Bell had looked at an empty wood rack in an abandoned freight barn and told a 15-year-old girl from New York, "This building is larger than your means." He had been right about the building. He had been wrong about the girl. She did not heat the building. She built a room inside it and warmed it with what the town scraped off its stable floors and threw away. Steam still rose from managed compost heaps in Hanson County long after the people who built the first one were gone, rising the way it always rose, constant, biological, indifferent to memory. And in the loft of a rebuilt barn at the edge of Cottonwood Crossing, a pasteboard valise sat on the shelf above it all, soft from handling, 50 years past the train that carried it west. They had measured her chances in cords of wood. She survived on what the town had been throwing away.